Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thursday afternoons are when we typically dive into the weekend preview of fantasy football. So we're going to be starting off. I'm going to be giving my starts and sits for Thursday night football. Be talking about some of my top plays for the weekend at each position. But if you have any questions as well or personal suggestions, happy to talk things out here. But that being said, starting with tonight's Thursday night football game between, of course, the Patriots and the Jets. This is a game that probably isn't going to be super high stakes in terms of your fantasy football week 3 outlook. I feel like there's only really a handful of players that are really, in that must-start category. You start with, the line, we talked about this earlier, is 38.5, so it sounds like Vegas is sort of expecting this to be a lower scoring game. Jets defense is probably a good play sort of on that note as well. Patriots could be, but I do myself have the Jets defense in a league, and I feel pretty confident about that. But starting with the quarterback position, Aaron Rodgers, Jacoby Brissett. Brissett is not really in that consideration anyways. Rodgers is, a tough call. He's fringe. If you are in a tough situation, Aaron Rodgers, you can talk yourself into it. Last week, Geno Smith did have a pretty good production game overall. He was 33 of 44 with a touchdown pass, which was good for about 18 points in terms of standard scoring. The thing is, though, is Geno found a lot of his success in that game sort of when he was scrambling out of the pocket, extending plays and making things happen from there. That I just don't know if I have that confidence in Aaron Rodgers with his lack of mobility at this point. That we did see sort of to that exact same point that last week it was around the second quarter where the Jets sort of started going with those quick hitter plays and those quick decisions, and that's when they started to get their passing game moving a little bit more. So, maybe they could take advantage of that. But I do feel like the Patriots are a pretty talented defense as a whole. They have a good pass rush. I think they're going to put pressure on Rodgers. And still, until I see a little bit more chemistry develop between Rodgers and his receivers, I'm going to have some hesitations there as to how much Rodgers can really do from a fantasy football perspective. He can still lead the Jets to wins, and I think that it's a work in progress there that will eventually get there. But from a fantasy football perspective, if I'm not mistaken, Rodgers is yet to top 200 yards in either game so far. I can double check that here as we speak. I don't want to, be incorrect on that. Rodgers might have, 167 yards week 1, 176 yards in week 2. I don't really expect that to change in a short week against a good Patriots defense. But as to some of the, higher echelon fantasy football players, Breece Hall, he was dealing with a quad injury during the game against the Titans. That sort of opened the door for Braylon Allen to get some more touches. But I think with that running back room, there are going to be enough opportunities for the both of them to take advantage of. It was Braylon Allen scoring a couple touchdowns. Breece Hall did still end up having a big week in PPR just based off of the amount of workload that he is going to get there. He is the leading receiver for the Jets in terms of targets up to this point. So I think that Breece Hall is a start in this game, especially if you are in PPR. The fact that he's dealing with this injury and then is heading into a short week does sketch me out a little bit, but ultimately, I think he's going to get the touches to at least be a running back 2 option with, of course, the upside of reaching that RB1 for this week. So I would start Breece Hall and Braylon Allen. If you're also, sort of in a tough situation, I think there's a chance that he could be a flex option for them. Somebody who could, like I just mentioned, benefit from the fact that Breece is dealing with that quad injury. Now, Breece, he's good to go. He's already gotten the green light. There's no question there that he's going to play, but Braylon Allen could, get a little bit more of the workload as Breece deals with this injury. On the other side with the Patriots, Ramondre Stevenson is a start to me. He's going to get a heavy workload that is the clear identity of this Patriots offense. It's what Alex Van Pelt prefers to do anyways, is establish the run game. Add on top of that as well, the fact that the pass game isn't all that great yet, and I don't really see it getting to that level with, mediocre wide receivers, a pretty bad blocking offensive line, and Jacoby Brissett at the helm, that I think they are going to continue to try and establish that run game. This is a Jets defense that has been struggling up to this point against the run, and they might be without their leading tackler in C.J. Mosley, who is dealing with a toe injury that he suffered against Tennessee in week 2, that I think there's going to be a clear emphasis, and not to mention as well, talk about the lack of a passing game. The secondary is really what's seen as the Jets' strength from a defensive perspective. So I think that he's going to get the touches and opportunities to do so. I would also throw in the fact that Antonio Gibson could maybe be, I don't think that he's going to have 95 yards on the ground like he did last week against the Seahawks, but I do feel like he could be a flex option if you are in a bind. Receivers, the only one I would really go with here is Garrett Wilson. You're not looking at anybody from the Patriots, obviously, and the lack of depth behind Garrett Wilson is very apparent as well. So I think that Garrett Wilson's a pretty good call there. I'm not anticipating him to put up wide receiver 1 numbers, but I think he can be a good number 2. Now, he is likely going to be shadowed by Christian Gonzalez for a lot of this game. Christian Gonzalez, a lot more Twitter debate than I really would have expected last week based off of his performance. Yeah, he was involved in that blown coverage for DK Metcalf, but I thought he did pretty well, all things considered, against DK, who is, of course, one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. So, a lot of eyes are going to be surrounding Garrett Wilson. I feel like we could see potentially a Mayo move of being Belichick-esque, of let's take away your best option and see what you can do from there. I think that he's a start, but he's not. I don't necessarily see that wide receiver 1 production from him tonight. But last player that I would take a flyer on is Hunter Henry. Had a big week 2 last week. Probably not, the level of production that ultimately you can expect from him, all things considered, because, Henry, I believe, was the leading receiver for New England last week, just in terms of the amount of targets that he was getting. I mean, the receivers obviously weren't getting anything. I think it was only maybe 3 targets for receivers themselves. It was 5 targets for receivers, and it was just Jalen Polk and KJ Osborne. But Hunter Henry coming off of a huge week, 8 receptions, 109 yards. The fact that CJ Mosley might be out as well, that's talking about a linebacker that might be matched up against Hunter Henry. Even if he does play, will he have that level of mobility? I think Hunter Henry is a pretty solid play, all things considered, tonight as well. Then I'm going to run through here some of my favorite plays of the week for each position. At quarterback, I have Jalen Hurts against the Saints. The Eagles are going to be looking to have some vengeance this week after getting clowned for their Monday Night Football loss against the Falcons this past week. The Saints have a good defense for sure, but I don't think it's to the point where they're going to fully take away Jalen Hurts. And what we did see in that Monday Night Football game is the fact that Hurts is not afraid whatsoever to run the ball and keep it himself. And that's something that, especially as A.J. Brown remains out, I think will be a possibly prominent part of this Eagles offense for the next handful of weeks. That ultimately, there really is not much receiver depth whatsoever behind Devontae Smith at this point, where it was Covey, I believe, that was the slot receiver and their punt returner that was second in the team in targets. That I feel like Hurts is going to have the rushing upside tonight. There's always the threat of the tush push like he did score on last week. And I think that all things considered, again, good Saints defense. I think that especially on the outside, a lot of promise there from their cornerbacks. But I think the dual threat of Hurts is going to be And especially for a Hurts that is going to definitely be looking to bounce back this week. I think he's going to have a lot of carries for himself and a lot of opportunities. I would also throw in Kyler Murray as a top play for the weekend playing the Detroit Lions. I still haven't loved what I've seen from their secondary yet up to this point. I think that Terrion Arnold, their number one draft pick this past year that they took in the first round, is eventually going to get there, but he's been struggling up to this point. We saw the Cardinals basically get to take their foot off the gas halfway through the second quarter last week, and now I think it's going to be a much more competitive game against the Lions that can be thrown on, history would tell us. Now, obviously, made all of those additions to the secondary to try and beef that up in Carlton Davis, Amik Robertson, and Terrion Arnold. But all things considered, I still feel like until we see them really shut down opposing quarterbacks, that this is going to be a situation where you're just going to take the dual threat of Kyler Murray now in a complete game here. Aiden Hutchinson would scare any quarterback, but I think that Kyler Murray is going to have himself a day. Running back, top play, I think it's going to be the same guy for a second week in a row, Alvin Kamara against the Eagles. Talking about an Eagles defense as well, that I think there is a pretty clear weakness, and that is in the running game. Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier combined for, I believe it was over 6 yards per carry last week. And I think that the Saints are going to be in a tough one. As excellent as Derek Carr has been up to this point, that I do feel like they're going to, have to be in this one a little bit more. Derek Carr, I'm sure they're going to let him take his shots downfield and such, but I think that the key to this Saints offense is establishing the run. Derek Carr has been excellent playing off of play action, but in order to actually have success doing so, you have to make sure the ground game gets going. I'm a big fan of this Saints offensive line as well, for whatever that's worth, and Kamara, maybe it's a little bit of a square pick to go with the guy that just scored 4 touchdowns last week as the top running back option the next week, but I still feel like it's more of a matchup thing than anything to me based off of playing against the Eagles. I liked Bijan last week playing against the Eagles, and he had a pretty good game for himself. I think Kamara is capable of doing so as well. We're going to fire through these last couple positions here, and then I want to get to Camden's comment here in the comment section here, so bear with me one more moment. Wide receiver, I like Amon-Ra St. Brown against the Cardinals. Now, this is a situation where I feel like we could see the Lions sort of try and revert back to establishing the ground game more. But that being said, you can only do that for so long. And I think that Amon-Ra has a pretty favorable matchup against what is a Cardinals defense that I think their weaknesses really are in the secondary, so I think that that's probably my favorite start there. Chris Olave could also be a pretty nice play. And then tight end, I think it's George Kittle versus the Rams by a pretty significant margin. Talking about Kittle, who's been, really the only top tight end that's fully lived up to expectations, and even week 1 wasn't great for him. But, it's him and Trey McBride are the two, and Trey McBride is another play that I think could be an interesting one here. But Kittle against a Rams team that just feels like they're beat up on right now, but is going to probably try and have a little bit of a bounce back. You have the Shanahan versus McVay rivalry a little bit in this game. Still no Deebo Samuel. Brandon Ayuk hasn't emerged yet, so I do think that Kittle is going to get a lot of touches. All right, now, if you have any questions there, we can circle back around, but I do want to get to Camden's comment here, where his situation, CJ Stroud, Jahmyr Gibbs, Ramondre Stevenson, Travis Etienne, Jamar Chase, Nico Collins, Jalen Waddle, and Trey McBride. 2 options. Would you rather trade Ramondre for Garrett Wilson or James Conner? Or he's adding some stuff to that. My first thoughts on your proposal there is that if you are going to trade Ramondre in this situation, I do really like Jahmyr Gibbs. I've never really been a Travis Etienne believer quite to the same degree as other people. So I think you'd be leaving yourself a little bit vulnerable at the running back position, and I really like James Conner this season. I think that this Cardinals offense is going to take, a number of steps forward as long as Kyler Murray is available for them. And what we've seen early on is that, they are hoping to establish that run game. Sure, last week you get the fireworks, of course, of Marvin Harrison Jr. in that first quarter. But if you go back to week 1 as well against Buffalo, the only reason the Cardinals were in that game to begin with was because they were running down the Bills' throats. And there's obviously been so much talk, and we're actually going to get to this idea of how opposing defenses are playing these games more in a moment. But, so much talk right now about the idea of establishing the run game with all of these two deep safeties, being prevalent early on in the NFL season that, I like Ramondre Stevenson anyways, that I would probably want to hold on to him. He is the focal point of that offense. But if you're giving me two options of making a move for Garrett Wilson or James Conner, I would lean with James Conner. Now, again, I don't know if I would necessarily, wholeheartedly go for Ramondre for James Conner. That does feel like a little bit of a lateral move. Two running backs that I do really like. James Conner is at least overall in a better offense, but you do also, and I know Ramondre missed the second half of last season. That was a little bit of a freak injury coming on a hip drop tackle. James Conner does have a little bit more of an extensive injury history, so I do feel like that's something that you do have to take into consideration. So looked like Camden here was maybe going to add to that proposal. We can maybe come back around that if there is more to the conversation, but as for now, we're going to be moving on here. I just sort of prefaced it a little bit, but earlier this morning there was a very large debate that sort of emerged on social media as Mel Kiper Jr. of ESPN went on Get Up and was advocating for the NFL to ban two deep safeties, a specific type of coverage for defenses. We'll sort of, it's mostly straightforward, but for those who don't know, we'll sort of explain it more on the other side here. So we are going to be diving into this very interesting and surprising debate and talking about, just generally speaking, whether or not it is something that could be implemented in the future. But before we do that, we are going to have to take our final break of the show. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.